Good afternoon. And welcome to the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee meeting. In attendance today, we have, of course, myself, Chair of the committee, representing the 4th District, Councilman Burnett, representing the 8th District. Virtually, we have Councilman Cohen, representing the 1st District. Councilman Costello is excused today. Councilwoman Ramos is also excused today, and Councilman Glover and Councilwoman Porter will be here soon. Nonetheless, we will get started. Representing the Office of the President, we've got, do we have any representation from the Office of the President? Okay, and representing the Mayor's Office, I see Adam. And Sophia. I'm sorry, Sophia. This afternoon, the committee will have a hearing on Resolution 22-0122R. Actually, before I jump into the explanation of the resolution, I just want to make it clear for my colleagues going forward, we will only accept votes by members in person. So I just want to make that clear going forward. That said, we hope to have a quorum later on, but we'll take care of that when we get there. Nonetheless, today we're going to do Resolution 22-0122R, Informational Hearing, Public Safety and Surveillance Technology, for the purpose of inviting representatives from the Department of Law, the Baltimore Police Department, the Department of Finance, and other interested parties to discuss the acquisition and use of facial recognition surveillance technology by Baltimore City government, how data from such equipment is used and stored, and any liability the city may face if the technology is or its data is misused. This bill was introduced on August 15, 2022, and it was sponsored by Councilmember Christopher Burnett, and I'll open the floor to Councilman Burnett for comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues and agency staff for joining us today. And so this is a continuation of the conversation we've had a few times in this committee. The last round of conversations was focused on the moratorium that the City Council passed back in December of 2022, and which expires in December of 2021, expires in December of 2022. We've used some time in the interim to work on a white paper and additional research to present to the council and to the community on the software itself. We've also conducted stakeholder interviews from a wide variety of experts in the field to kind of get a better picture of how this technology is used. And what I was hoping to do today, Mr. Chair, after we hear from the agencies, was present some of the feedback that we've received. The committee, we're making some last-minute edits to the white paper, but we will try to get out to the full council in the mayor's office today, following the hearing. But that's all I got right now. Is just supposed to just be an update on where things stand, and we do plan to introduce legislation in the coming weeks to build out a regulatory framework for facial recognition software in Baltimore City, both the public and commercial use. But this is not that. This is just what have we been up to for the last year or so. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Burnett. We will now move on to agency representatives for their agency reports, and we're going to start off with the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, Monty stands by its bill report.
Thank you, Director Jackson. Next, we'll move on to BSIT.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. BSIT stands behind its bill report.
Thank you. And for the record, just state your name.
Todd Carter.
Thank you, Director. Next, we have the Police Department.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Michelle Wurzberger. I'm the Chief of Staff for the Baltimore Police Department. We do stand by our report. We have a number of members of the department with us just in case there are any questions, and I'll just very briefly introduce them. We have Deputy Commissioner Cherie Briscoe. We have Chief Reyna Delarocco. We have Director Graham Campbell. Major Sam Hood, Lieutenant Habib Kim, Angela Sabatino, who is a research analyst with us, and of course we have Shannon Conway. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we've got the Law Department.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hillary Ruley on behalf of the Law Department. We approve the resolution for form and legal sufficiency.
Thank you, Hillary. And lastly, we have the Office of the Comptroller.
Good afternoon, Casey Kelleher for the Office of the Comptroller, and we stand by a report. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Do you want to go into your presentation? Sure. Okay. I will hand over to the sponsor for presentation.
Okay. So we have a PowerPoint that we'll go through. Myself and Kimberly Sauer, my Chief of Staff and Director of Policy, will sort of be tag teaming. So in the basics of what this technology is, facial recognition involves gathering biometrical data on facial features. So the software looks at, it's not so much of trying to make a direct match between images as much as it's looking at the distance between the eyes, the nose, the mouth, basically data points on one's face to then run through algorithms in a set of already existing images to compare and basically come up with a recommendation that these people are likely, this image is likely the same person that you may see in CCTV footage or some other database. In its current form, the technology does require secondary human analysis, meaning that there is a person on the other end, and I know the police department has talked about this previously, that they have both the analyst that's using the system, and then there's a second person that confirms the confirmation. And so that's typically how the software confirmation process works. All right, next slide. So these are some of the ways that facial recognition is used in a multitude of ways. By law enforcement, obviously, they are using it to identify potential suspects in support of their criminal investigations. In our conversations with folks in the hospitality industry and gaming industry, we've learned that the software is used to try and curate personalized experiences for people on cruises or in casinos or in art studios to try and match the data that they've provided that company of what their interests are or what that company may have curated or collected on their own about their customers to try and do things like provide them the type of drink that they like to have when they're standing on the balcony, or to have a certain piece of artwork show in a sort of digital or virtual setting, or some of the ways. It's been used for ticketing purposes as well. There's also the private security industry, which uses it for things like protecting software systems, access to laptops, physical access to facilities. So some employers use this to require their employees to be able to gain entrance into secure facilities. School systems and employers have been using this as well for things like standardized testing and for, sorry, I can't see the bottom part, or to confirm that people are working or working on certain specific documents. And so those are some of the just basic examples. We've learned that there's also the additional potential uses that may include things like body-worn cameras, traffic cameras, like other sort of the expansive CCTV potential. I will flag that in some of the conversations that we've had particularly with the school uses and with employers, is that the technology has raised some issues, and there's been some lawsuits involving education institutions using this because it does not do a great job at recognizing people with physical disabilities or individuals who may be transgender or simply change their hair and look completely different, or black and brown people. And that's what we've heard a lot when speaking to machine learning experts. But those are some of the general ways that it's used. And this is actually a study that was done just this year, actually, 2022. We had a conversation with a machine learning expert who provided this, and there's a link that we'll send out, Mr. Chair, that has a link to the study and a folder with all of the citations that we include. But in short, they found that there were the use of facial recognition software by law enforcement led to a greater racial disparity in arrest. And what they found in this paper, and it was the sample size, it was peer reviewed, and the sample size was something that they felt was of a certain amount to actually be credible, I'd say. In that not only were there an increase in arrest of black and brown people, but they saw a negative association with the deployment for white people, in that there were lower arrests made of white individuals after municipalities deployed this. And they looked at, I want to say 1,136 municipalities. And so this was a national study that was done, and again, we'll provide this to the committee, and it's referenced in our white paper as well. Anything else on that one? Because you were part of that conversation. No. Okay. And I would also flag that when we looked at the corporate response over the last few years for the commercial uses of this software, we have a letter that was sent by the CEO of IBM to Congress following the death of George Floyd and many others, noting that IBM would no longer be providing the software to law enforcement agencies, noting that there is a responsibility that vendors have pertaining to testing for bias, particularly when it's used by law enforcement. There's been some notable false arrests made by this, but a lot of acknowledgement that the standards in which, and we talk about this in the paper a lot, the standards in which the software is tested in the beginning is overwhelmingly tested on by white males and Asian males, and so the software itself is, because of that sort of as the backdrop, is better equipped to recognize white males and Asian males. And there's a video that we'll show in a second by a MIT researcher, Joy Bullawimi, who has been leading the charge on sort of the academic research side of this, who speaks about a lot of the issues that pertain to identifying black and brown people using these systems. And the white paper goes into a little bit more on this issue around some of the additional concerns, but just flagging that both this was sent by IBM, but Amazon, Microsoft, and several other multinational companies have also raised concerns about the accuracy and potential bias on this software. And we have a video that we're going to try and play from a late night television host, John Oliver, who did a episode on this a few years ago. And this is the segment that talks about Joy Bullawimi's work on this issue. And we did have some issues with sound, so hopefully it works.
I think someone has to be muted when I unmute. Or it's gonna echo. I think that someone's system over here has to be muted, or it's gonna do an echo when I play it on my laptop.
Okay. I think she's saying the system will have to be muted, not to have an echo.
The point is, this technology raises troubling philosophical questions.
Yeah.
Is it possible to just pull up?
The point is, this technology raises troubling philosophical questions about personal freedom. And right now, there are also some very immediate practical issues. Because even though it is this technology...
Can you send the video, a link to the video, to Matthew Peters?
I think you'd be able to send it with the time parameters we said.
There's a consistent 4-second delay.
Okay.
We can come back to that. Yeah, once we figure it out. Okay.
So
You wanna
unmute it.
go to the next slide?
So we'll come back to the video. If you could send the link to Matthew Peters, we can see if we can play it through this computer and get it to work.
Okay.
Please continue.
To summarize what's in the video, is a study that she did where she basically tested some of the leading software at the time. So I want to say the video is probably 2 years old now, where she tried to get it to recognize her and other black faces, including using like Oprah Winfrey. They use all of the black members of Congress, like people who are pretty visible and well-known in society, and all of the software systems struggled to do that. And when she used her own face, she had to put a white mask on to be able to be recognized by the system. And so the clip talks a little bit about that and some of the other challenges with that. But that was, at the time, one of the sort of breakthrough studies that showed that there were some very serious concerns about the ability for the systems themselves to recognize the correct person.
The whole episode. But I can play it through here without unmuting my computer.
University student as a suspect in a heinous crime, which made for a pretty awful finals week.
On the morning of April 25th, in the midst of final season, I woke up in my dorm room to 35 missed...
Good. Oh yeah, this one's completely different. Sure, he does also have a button under his office desk, but all it does is release lilac air freshener. This is the good version. The point is, this technology raises troubling philosophical questions about personal freedom. And right now, there are also some very immediate practical issues. Because even though it is currently being used, this technology is still very much a work in progress. And its error rate is particularly high when it comes to matching faces in real time. In fact, in the UK, when human rights researchers watched police put one such system to the test, they found that only 8 out of 42 matches were verifiably correct. And that's even before we get into the fact that these systems can have some worrying blind spots, as one MIT researcher found out when testing out numerous algorithms, including Amazon's own recognition system.
At first glance, MIT researcher Joy Buolamwini says the overall accuracy rate was high, even though all companies better detected and identified men's faces than women's. But the error rate grew as she dug deeper.
Lighter male faces were the easiest to guess the gender on, and darker female faces were the hardest.
One system couldn't even detect if she had a face, and the others misidentified her gender. White guy, no problem.
Yeah. White guy, no problem, which, yes, is the unofficial motto of history. But it's not like what we needed right now was for computers to somehow find a way to exacerbate the problem. And it gets worse. In one test, Amazon's system even failed on the face of Oprah Winfrey. Someone so recognizable, her magazine only had to type the first letter of her name and your brain auto-completed the rest. And that's not all. A federal study of more than 100 facial recognition algorithms found that Asian and African-American people were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white men. So that is clearly concerning. And on top of all of this, some law enforcement agencies have been using these systems in ways they weren't exactly designed to be used.
In 2017, police were looking for this beer thief. The surveillance image wasn't clear enough for facial recognition software to identify him. So instead, police used a picture of a lookalike, which happened to be actor Woody Harrelson. That produced names of several possible suspects and led to an arrest.
Yeah, they used a photo of Woody Harrelson to catch a beer thief, and how dare you...
Okay, sorry. He goes off the deep end after that. So found the clip a little amusing, but obviously raising some very real issues that still remain. And so this was the impetus for bringing the moratorium, 21-001 in the last term, which placed a one-year moratorium on the use of facial recognition by the public and private entities with some restrictions. And so in the bill, we define facial surveillance as any automated or semi-automated process that assists in identifying or verifying individuals based on physical characteristics of their face. And it's obviously referencing the software that uses it. And as I mentioned earlier, it's set to expire the end of this year. So there were some inclusions that we, the inclusions were what the ban applied, the moratorium applied to. And so it was CCTV cameras, license plate readers, gunshot detection software, video audio monitoring systems, wearable body cameras, X-ray vans, RFID systems, and other certain specific tools and software. We did also have a lot of exclusions from the definition after having conversation with a number of agencies, MONSI, Department of Transportation, Department of General Services, and the Police Department, which I would note was not included in any of this other than the ability to additionally procure new technology. The Police Department wasn't included in the bill because of the lack of local control over the Police Department, and so they were excluded entirely. But there were other systems that we left in that focused on entrance and access to facilities. This does not pertain to like the use of cell phones or anything like that that use a different type of biometric matching software. We also did not include, after conversations with the Port Authority of Maryland, there were some federal guidelines that needed to be left in as well. We were preempted rather due to some federal guidelines around the port access. We also left in early warning systems and other sort of medical devices. And I'll let Kim talk about the research that we spent the last several months working on. But in short, we reached out to the Legal and Data Design Clinic at University of Baltimore School of Law and worked with 4 students who I do want to acknowledge for their hard work. These were law students in that particular law clinic, Corey Horowitz, Christopher Myberg, Brandon Moore, and Jillian Trotter, and their professor, Director Colin Starger, who led their effort as a part of their ability to graduate from law school. They did a analysis of policies from Maine, Washington, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, and Virginia. Because what we've seen is that there has not been any federal, substantive federal action on this. And so a number of states and local jurisdictions have been either passing bans on the use of facial recognition technology or building out regulatory frameworks that restrict the certain types of uses. And we'll go into a little bit more detail. But Kim, do you want to talk about the process for the white paper and the interviews?
Yeah, sure. So hi, I'm Kimmy Sauer. I'm Councilman Burnett's Chief of Staff, Director of Policy. I worked with the Legal Data and Design Clinic through the University of Baltimore Law School. One of the focuses of this legal clinic was compiling and analyzing those states that had already passed legislation and really trying to identify common elements that make up comprehensive and responsible policies. Like Councilman Burnett said, right now, more states and local jurisdictions are passing regulations because we do not have anything at the federal level. And so really trying to find what would best protect Baltimore's communities and also being in lieu of a ban and making sure that we have comprehensive policy that supports both sides of this equation. So we have this white paper that we developed. It's in a Google Drive that we're going to give everyone the information to so that you can all read it. But essentially, we've identified a number of different elements of policy that we're exploring as part of our regulatory framework. And just to go into the stakeholder survey, we've been meeting with various stakeholders across different sectors, both private and public, to really gauge where we are on the use of this technology. And we've been trying to meet with as many people as possible because we know that this is a multifaceted technology and there's not just one use to it. And there are benefits, but there are also consequences to using this technology. So we asked a series of questions to each one of the stakeholders, and we will have that compiled for everyone. But a lot of the information that we received from these conversations was the narrative part, and that was really the meat of the conversation to help us guide these regulations that are protective but also allow the use of the technology. But just to kind of, from a bird's eye view, the majority of responses from stakeholders we did find agreement. There were other opposing opinions to some of these factors, but overall, the majority of the stakeholders that we interviewed found commonality or common ground among the list that is on the screen. So with the first and foremost being that facial recognition technology in its current state is biased against people of color and women. And that there is an opinion that it's not ready for prime time in its current state because of those bias. We're still meeting with stakeholders, and we'll go through that a little later, but we did get that it should be heavily regulated, both in the private sector and public sector, and especially by uses of law enforcement. And the white paper goes into a lot more detail about our stakeholder surveys.
So as you can see, and again, we'll provide the list of questions that were asked, but there were over 20 interviews. We still have more, as we've been briefing members of the council in more detail on the white paper. In those conversations, we've had a few council members say, hey, there's a business owner in my district that has some issues with the moratorium or opinions about it. You know, can you include them in this conversation? Additional academic folks as well, and so we've been done that. And if there are other people, obviously looking at the agency side that would like to be included in the interviews, we'll continue those so that we're making sure we're getting as much feedback as possible. So the first segment of the white paper just talks about the historic issues with the deployment of surveillance technology in Baltimore City, which, you know, things like that have been pretty controversial, like the spy plane, Stingray, ShotSpotter has come under scrutiny at the national level. Obviously, there's the City Watch network as well that both, you know, folks for and against have raised concerns about where those are placed and the potential impact that it has on incarceration or disparate incarceration of Black and brown people in Baltimore City. And so essentially what we found in a lot of those conversations and in the research is that a number of cities have had similar issues raised about disparate impact and have resulted in either bans or building out restrictive regulatory frameworks because of the harm that technology broadly has caused, particularly communities of color. Not in any way saying that there are no beneficial uses of these technologies, but what we found is that without a real regulatory framework being put in on the front end or extensive research before deployment, there have been unintended consequences with that. So what we looked at, or what we are currently looking at, so as noted, the moratorium ends in the end of December. We are in the process of crafting a regulatory bill that will look at a few key areas. And these were not only areas in which both stakeholders, advocates, both for and against, noted needed to be in place or should be in place, but also these were commonalities when we looked at the national landscape of legislation that other jurisdictions have already taken up. These were the sort of, I've been describing them in conversations as buckets of policy that each of the bills, there's been, these patterns have emerged. And so the first is the intention of the use, whether that's a law enforcement use or a commercial entity, or what we describe, there's been uses that were pertaining to, entertainment purposes or et cetera, but really narrowing the scope of, a lot of jurisdictions have tried to narrow the types of things it can be used for. Data retention has come up in almost every conversation as this information is valuable. Knowing the technology, when you're looking at it through some sort of CCTV camera, for example, it's able to identify in some instances in real time who that person is, who they are with. There's another example in that John Oliver episode where there's a website where you can literally, he shows a gentleman takes a picture of a woman in a coffee shop and then uploads the picture into a facial recognition database. That database then spits out all of her social media information, all of the Facebook, Instagram, Twitter accounts associated with that person. And so you have the potential for the sale of that data. Obviously, that company used some sort of scraping technology, which is similar to what like Clearview Analytica did, or Clearview AI did, where they scrape social media accounts and then compile that information into searchable databases and are marketing that to companies, they're marketing it to government agencies, and there's no real restrictions codified that restrict that. I will flag that when we had the last hearing, I brought this up to the police department, and they noted that that was not supposed to be the protocol that Baltimore City Police were using, but would flag that the company was reaching out directly to law enforcement, like directly to detectives to say, hey, this is something that can assist in your investigation, you should try it out. And a lot of people had no idea that they're in that system. Would flag that the police departments or the state's system, which I believe is CMS, we were blanking on the acronym, so if you guys can help me out later, I'll take it, because we were trying to put that in the white paper, and I was like, I don't remember what it stands for, but the state system uses license plate photos, any sort of government photo. So all of us in this room are probably in that system already. And without your, obviously, consent or ability to opt in, opt out, which is another area in which a lot of the legislators in other jurisdictions have tried to restrict some of those uses by either having policies in which people have to opt into the use of their data or opt out of the use of the data. You can keep it in the same slide, sorry, I'll ahead. Security and access, a lot of jurisdictions have very clear and concise guidelines on how the data is stored, particularly for commercial uses. There's some jurisdictions that outright restrict the sale of data or any uses that are outside of the scope of the policy. There are also requirements in some jurisdictions for auditing. There are jurisdictions that require federal audits on the accuracy of the software. There's a national agency that you can send software to, and they will test for accuracy. And some jurisdictions have placed floors, reporting requirements, and certain thresholds of accuracy. And the reason for that, just to elaborate a little bit, is we know in the city end of things, procurement can take an extensive amount of time, and often the software that you may have purchased 10 years ago it may not be the most accurate type of software now. And so there's been issues in other jurisdictions pertaining to just as the software gets better and improved over time, one, the cost may change, but the need to upgrade software licenses will change. And are the agencies some jurisdictions require agencies to keep up, essentially, for lack of a better term, keep up with the Joneses and have certain minimums of accuracy if they are using this type of software. The other issue that some of the machine learning experts raised to us was that even if you make the agency side or the commercial use have to have a certain threshold of accuracy, there's also issue with the data going in. And so we don't have that addressed in this bill, or won't likely have it addressed, but there have been concerns about the fact that, you know, the system that the police department's using license plate photos, which are taken with a white backdrop, the person facing directly towards the camera with perfect lighting. If you're comparing, if someone is an armed robbery at a 7-Eleven and the camera's some sort of outdated camera that isn't high resolution, but more importantly is not likely to deliver that same level of image quality, because the person committing the act is not standing behind a white backdrop in perfect lighting. The camera may be facing at a different angle. It may be a partial look at their face. It may be someone that looks like Woody Harrelson, as you've seen in the video, and that information is then uploaded into the database. And so there was a study done by Georgetown University called Garbage In, Garbage Out that talks about a lot of these issues pertaining to the quality of the images that are uploaded. I'm not sure if it's the police department's policy pertaining to drawings, but some other jurisdictions have uploaded literal like sketches and drawings from interviews with victims to try and see if they can get a match that way. And what we've learned is that when you have that as the policy or an allowable use of the technology, it degrades the level of accuracy and the quality assurance of the images that are in the database moving forward. And so it can make things less accurate over time when you're using that. And so a number of jurisdictions have created higher standards for the type of information that can be used. And then there's the accountability when harm occurs. I think of Illinois, for example. They were the first in the nation to pass a biometric regulatory bill in 2008. And they're one of the few jurisdictions that allows for private right of action in that if there's a harm of a citizen by either a commercial entity or a governmental entity, you can sue, essentially, for that harm. And there's been a number of lawsuits involving multinational companies like Facebook and others that have violated the biometric bill that they have in Illinois. Those are just examples, but if we want to...
Yeah. Just one thing that I do want to lift up is a number of stakeholders that we've met with. Just going back to the potential sale of this data, made remarks that our biometrics are being used as currency. And when they are very unique to you as an individual, right? And so when companies are profiting off of this data that is unique very specifically to you, that is a major issue. And almost unanimously, the stakeholders we met with were very strongly against the sale, both to the government and to private companies. We had a few that didn't take an opinion either way, but the majority of our stakeholders were against the sale of the data, and that is a real aspect, especially as these major corporations are profiting billions of dollars off of this data.
And we'll flag that the concern is that if someone if there's a way you can change your social security number, you can change other identifying information about yourself, you can't change your biometrics. And so if that information, if people that have access to that data, it takes it a step further than normal identity theft if there are breaches in systems. And so that's why that's a concern, because this is absolutely Adam Abadir. And, Adam Abadir's biometric data, his address may change, sorry, Adam, driver's license info may change, but who he is and that system's ability to recognize him does not. And so that's incredibly valuable for commercial entities to be able to sell. And they can combine that information with a lot of other things. So if CVS knows that, sorry to Adam, pick on you again, is using this software, not only Adam loves to get a discount, so he signed up for the little consumer discount card, 10% off, so it's logging his purchases. It's able to build a profile of the types of things that he's purchasing, but also the lifestyle that he may be living. If Adam is for the first time buying diapers, now we know that there's a child in the photo, his family's grown, maybe they'll market different types of information to that person. And it's even more valuable when you know that Adam is now walking in the store and they can follow you around to see your shopping habits and whatnot. And so it's pretty creepy and dystopian, at least to me, that companies not only aren't regulated to notify or disclose to the slide that's up or provide some sort of public notification. Some jurisdictions have required companies to either allow people to opt in, opt out, or have some level of consent for their information to be used. We'll flag that in Maryland. Again, I noted that your official ID, your driver's license, ID cards are uploaded into the system. Most people have no idea that that's happening. There's no required public notification that when you take that driver's license photo that you're now also being uploaded into a law enforcement database. The same has applied for commercial uses as well, and some jurisdictions have required people to be able to either consent to their information being used or have codified some sort of process to opt out of the system itself and set criteria for how to do that. Again, I mentioned this before. So Massachusetts, for example, has a pretty expansive segment of their policy, Senate Bill 2687, that really regulates how data is used. In this particular instance, they do not allow the sale of data collected for facial recognition. Obviously, they allow it to have some sort of use internally, and they require, they set a threshold for certain practices that the company must have, required audits, et cetera, for their databases to ensure that this information that's being collected is held at as high as a possible standard as any other proprietary information that the company may be collecting or using internally. So going back to Massachusetts again, they also do, I think, a pretty good job at setting restrictive time frames for how long the data can be kept. They require, if a person has reached out to them saying, hey, I want to opt out of the system, they have 30 days to clear all of that data. And I would note that this is a trend that we're seeing in the tech industry generally, where companies like Facebook and Instagram are allowing people to download the data that's been collected by the company, and if you request the ability to delete it, I'm not sure that they actually do, but I'm going to say that they do, and go for it. This is an example of a type of policy in which the state itself has set those requirements for being able to opt out of the company's system. Next one. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier as well, that some jurisdictions, Massachusetts is one, Illinois is another, that have private right of action, which is something that came up a lot in the conversations to allow the citizens to be able to self-report where harm has been done. The reason for this is that there's obviously, if we were to pass some sort of framework, the ability to enforce it is somewhat difficult. And so these jurisdictions have allowed citizens to be a part of that enforcement mechanism by being able to take civil action against companies that are not complying with that state policy around data retention, data access, the sale of data, the deletion of data, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one or two jurisdictions that have done it in this way. And I'll flag too that, I know this actually came out a little grainy, but this is from an article in a publication called New Republic that raises concerns generally about the Sixth Amendment as it pertains to law enforcement use and due process. There are no, and this is my understanding in conversations with the police department previously, were that there are, and with folks that are defense attorneys, they don't have to, the law enforcement does not have to disclose that they used facial recognition technology to identify a suspect. It's a tool that's a part of their investigation, but it's not one that the courts in Maryland require any sort of disclosure to the defendant. And so some jurisdictions have required or restricted, either required some sort of notification during that process. Some jurisdictions have required law enforcement to obtain warrants ahead of time so that there's some sort of documentation in that way. But currently in the state of Maryland, there are these requirements do not exist. And so this is another area that we are looking at so that there is a lot more transparency in the use of the system as it pertains to law enforcement. And then there were other questions that were raised in our conversations. You know, what happens if there are just general surveillance uses of community members to identify people? We know that this is something that is happening or has happened. Again, we'll flag that under different leadership under the Baltimore City Police Department, there were issues that were raised in 2015 about the police department using facial recognition to scan crowds at Freddie Gray related protests. And they were identifying individuals as an attempt to sort of freeze or add some level of chill or fallback on the protests. And so that was something that the General Assembly took up an investigative hearing, I want to say in 2016 on that particular issue. We'll flag that is not the policy of currently the policy of the Baltimore City Police Department now. But without any regulations, obviously that's a government agency. There's nothing that would stop a private corporation or private security firm from using this technology to surveil anyone else. There are literally no restrictions on any of this right now. And so that sort of gets into concerns about abuse, the ability to track people. And one of the conversations we've had with folks in the hospitality industry and in the banking industry, where we learned from folks in the banking industry that they've begun to integrate facial recognition into things like ATMs and are sharing that information with law enforcement agencies. Obviously, most notably if there is a crime that takes place at the bank, but we were told in those conversations that there's regular sharing of information with with the Sheriff's Department and others pertaining to investigations that people, again, may not be fully aware of. And that was a conversation that we had with the folks in the banking industry on that. So I see heads nodding and BPD. That's what they told us. So that's what they said in the interview. And then there was also, we did have a conversation with, again, folks in the Port Authority, and they raised concern, or the ability to, like I mentioned before, like curate experiences for people, where it can go the other way. And that was the concern. We spoke with a professor at Coppin University who raised the concern that while folks in the hospitality industry can use this to curate good experiences for people, it can also work the other way, where if they're able to combine both information on who you are, what your current, if it's, the professor raised the concerns that while, if they have some concerns about your ability to pay for the service or pay for the experience, that they can also negate that experience. And so be a little bit slower at delivering that Mai Tai that you love to have on the cruise when you're standing outside, and maybe not show up at all, to have a discriminatory use as well, was something that was raised by that particular individual. So again, how far is too far? Obviously, someone's ability to get a drink is one thing, but the other more serious concerns pertaining to active surveillance is a greater concern. And I'll flag that these aren't sort of very dystopian fictional ideas. We've seen other jurisdictions use it in those ways. We've seen this used internationally. The example given is when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, folks were using the technology that was left behind to scan faces on arterial roads to figure out who was cooperating with the U.S. government, and who knows what happened to those people. And so, obviously, that's not the current state of affairs here in Baltimore City. Without building out a regulatory framework on this, something like this could be occurring or could be used in those ways. It's not off the table, and it's not an accusation saying that anyone plans to do that, but we've seen other jurisdictions in other countries actually use it in those ways.
And one thing to just lift up is one of the machine learning experts from one of our federal stakeholders actually pointed out the general public has no idea how far this technology has the ability to go. And so with that being said, not knowing what it's capable of, not having public-facing transparency on how it's being implemented now is one of the biggest concerns.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So next steps. So as I mentioned previously, we are the moratorium is expiring December 31st. We are working very diligently to build out a regulatory framework that will present to the council that will be very much influenced by the research that we've been doing over the last year on this particular topic. You can reach out to Kim for more information on that, as well as if you are interested. We put together a Google folder that has a lot of the underlying research that we use over the last year for review, as well as the white paper as well. So we're going to send that proactively out to the council and MOGR and the council president's office, but it's something that's public, so if folks that are watching on Charm TV want to get that as well, it's something that we're going to make available to everybody. That's all I got, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. I appreciate all the analysis and sort of attempt to grasp the breadth and depth of this issue. I know it's a lot of information. We are going to open up to questions. I've got one myself for the sponsor. I know you mentioned that there wasn't much motion on the federal level by way of legislation for this. I do have concerns about a fractured approach, given, of course, a lot of the companies that this would affect are working across the country. So I believe in some degree that there's something to be gained by having certainly federal legislation, and if not federal, state legislation. I do know that there was a bill that was introduced, I think in 2001, I don't know if it did pass, that banned facial recognition, or attempted to ban facial recognition in federal agencies. Do you know if there's any other efforts at the federal level, or if there may be efforts in this session at the state level?
So, a couple things I'll say. Not aware of any current federal legislation. The last bill that we found was from 2020 on this, and I can send it out to the committee for review, but it did not pass. There have been several attempts at the state level to either regulate or ban. Those have been led by, on the Senate side, Charles Sidnor has at least made, I want to say in the last 5 sessions, attempts to regulate or ban facial recognition. Delegate Love also put in a Biometrics Privacy Act bill this last session, and I want to say the 2 prior. Both were unsuccessful. And so I think it's one of those things where we can continue to wait for preemptive action by the state or federal government, but without their action, we were living in a city where there are no regulations at all and no protections for the citizens while we wait for other the state to take action on this. And so I do think that we have a responsibility to act in that sense. I would also flag that if there were successful efforts at the state or federal level, those would likely preempt whatever the council passes anyway, obviously depending on what is passed. And so we would have the opportunity both to make adjustments if there is preemption, to fill in the gaps that may exist, or to roll things back that may not be as restrictive or go as far. But I think waiting on Congress seems to be a lost cause at this point, particularly the political dynamics right now around the control of the House and the Senate. I will continue to. I have supported both Delegate Love's and Sid Nor's legislation. I'm a part of their task force, put a task force together on this issue. We've given testimony and support, saying that this is something we'd like to see at the state level, because I agree that having one set of guidelines, one set of rules for the entire state of Maryland or the country is ideal, depending on what they're trying to do. But other jurisdictions have taken action, and we're not leading on this. This is not one of those things where Baltimore would be the first place to do it. We're actually pretty far behind. I mean, Illinois passed one of the earlier bills back in 2008, and that was in the very early days of this technology being developed, and they were one of the first to get ahead of it, and other jurisdictions have followed suit. So, I do think that we do have some responsibility to act. Obviously, what we come up with, we have to, dialogue and debate and amend and everything else, but that'd be my response to that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think there may be components certainly at the local level that makes sense, and I think there are certainly pieces at the state level that would make more sense at the state or federal level. And I haven't quite worked out the pieces of it. I appreciate how you lined up a lot of the different policies by category to help us understand some of those components. So I'm interested to see what comes of those suggestions and considerations. I will say though, for some of the broader considerations so far as protections, one of the main things that I thought of was the moment you cross the Baltimore City border and you go into a store in the county or in the surrounding counties, like those protections immediately fade away. So I think, of course, working at the state level, of course, coordinating with our regional partners, I think is important. I do agree with you. I think something needs to be done here. And I think, we as a council need to figure out sort of what that means. But this is a very delicate topic, and I think what I can't say and what I don't know, and maybe we'll hear from folks in testimony. I know we do have folks in the room from the industry, but I don't know how much this technology has improved in the last 2 years, particularly because 4 years ago it didn't really exist. I mean, the sophistication of facial recognition was not great. And of course, with a lot of these technologies, they need time to work themselves out. I don't remember when Apple came out, for instance, and not to name a particular company, but when they came out with facial recognition on our phones, and I think that's something that has proved desirable. So thinking about this sort of web of policy implications, I think will be super important. Thinking about how protections here in Baltimore City will only stop at the borders, and how we want to be thoughtful about fractured policy beyond the borders is, I think, really important. And I encourage you certainly, as we're thinking about this, that partnership up and down the chain, the federal and state, is going to be really important for, I think, success on this matter. But I really appreciate all the efforts here. And any other questions from folks? Oh, and I want to acknowledge Councilman Glover, who joined us a little bit late. Thank you. Any other questions?
Adam raises his hand.
Adam, please.
Adam Abdur, Mayor's Office of Government Relations. Not a question, but just acknowledging that we do have a representative of the Department of Finance here, and Chief Carter had to step out, but we do have a representative from BSID who's available to answer questions.
Thank you. Any questions? No. Questions?
I don't know. Councilman Cohen's screen turned on. There we go.
Oh, there we go. Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the agencies that are assembled, and thank you to the bill sponsor for just a really, really, really comprehensive presentation, and appreciate the deep dive that you've been doing on this issue for the past couple of years. Just wanted to say that, unfortunately, I mean, it would be great if the federal government was more engaged in regulating technology, whether it's social media, whether it's facial recognition technology. Sadly, I think Congress has abdicated that responsibility, and I think it has fallen to cities and municipalities, and in some cases states, to take action, which is somewhat unfortunate because obviously these technologies are ubiquitous, and as Chairman Conway suggests, it's a bit strange to have like a patchwork of different regulatory frameworks set up. But I do think it's important for Baltimore to be a leader in this space and really, draw our own line as it relates to facial recognition technology and some of the flaws and foibles that still exist with it. My question, I think for the bill sponsor, I am just curious in terms of the timeline, assuming that we were to get local control of the police department, obviously that's on the ballot, in terms of what you're proposing, what would be the implications as of right now for BPD if in fact we did get local control? And apologies, I know this is somewhat of a hypothetical, but assuming that may happen, just curious how that would change the math.
Thank you, Councilman Cohen. That's a good question. So at the pace that we're going, it'd be my understanding that wouldn't, if it were to be approved by the voters, wouldn't go into effect until January 1 of next year. Is that your understanding, Mr. Chair?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's some questions about timing. So what our plan was for the bill was to try and delay implementation of any regulations related to the police department to that point. Obviously, that'll require some conversations with the law department and with DLR on how to do that. Or if that's not possible, the other lane would just be to wait until we have local control and then pass amendments. I will flag that we did have a conversation with Baltimore Police Department about this particular topic. They were part of the stakeholder interviews, and I think it's okay to say, Michelle, that there was not resistance to building out or having conversations about regulating facial recognition, the use of facial recognition by the police department. They were not opposed to that. Obviously, the devil's in the details on what we're actually proposing, which I'm not prepared to say at this time because I legitimately don't have a bill just yet. So I don't have. It'll cover those buckets it'll be things in those buckets that we put in the presentation are the things that we're going to be looking at. But at this time, we haven't had any conversations about the specifics. But it was comforting to hear that the police department was okay with building out a framework. And if you want to add to that, Michelle, you can speak on that.
Yeah, just for a moment. So, when this bill came around the first time.
Michelle, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. So, again, for the record, Michelle Wurzberger, Chief of Staff for the Baltimore Police Department. When this bill first came around, we had laid out a number of suggestions for basically turning the moratorium into a regulatory process. We do think that there should be restrictions. We think that there should be accountability. We have established our own internal process that is still evolving, still fine-tuning. The devil is in the details. We definitely look forward to talking with you further, Councilman, and of course, Kimmy, as you start finalizing that framework, or at least the draft of the framework. So, thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Councilmember Burnett, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Cohen. Any other questions for the agencies or for the sponsor? Okay, seeing no further questions, we are going to move on to public testimony. We're going to start with folks in the room. If you have not signed up to testify, you may sign up in the back. And for those who are joining us virtually, please use the raise hand function and we'll acknowledge you. If you are joining us by phone, we'll unmute you and give you a chance to testify. If you don't wish to testify, please say so. We're going to give each person 3 minutes, 3 minutes to testify. If you need more than 3 minutes, I encourage you to send us your testimony via email, or if you are here in person, a written version of it. We'd be happy to accept that. With that, the first person I have on the list is Mr. Jake Parker. And please state your name for the record and your affiliation, if you're affiliated with it.
Hi, my name is Jake Parker. I'm with the Security Industry Association. We are headquartered in Silver Spring, Maryland. Represent security technology solutions providers, including dozens that are headquartered here in the state. Among our members include many of the leading, or all of the leading providers of facial recognition in the United States. And as an industry, our position is we think the technology can be incredibly powerful, but it can be fielded in a responsible and ethical way under the right set of rules and principles. So we appreciate being able to talk to Councilmember Burnett in his office as part of this process, and we are pleased to hear that he does not intend to propose extending the current ban which is in place, which in our opinion hasn't protected anyone but has caused nothing but confusion and actually ended some beneficial applications that are impacting safety of folks in Baltimore. It will also impact, if the police department comes under the city's control, their current investigative capabilities and crime-solving abilities. I'll mention the localities and states that have looked at banning the technology, particularly for law enforcement use, are really taking a second look at that. Just in the last year, we've had a reversal of the ban, short-lived ban in Virginia on the technology, as well as in the city of New Orleans most recently this summer. I also wanted to point out in the analysis presented earlier, the technology is used in investigations with respect to criminal suspects as a part of an identification process or to aid identification. But it's also important for witnesses to crimes and victims of crimes. We saw a report earlier this year about someone who was exonerated of being accused of manslaughter in Florida after facial recognition was used to identify a key witness in that case that were identified as not being the driver of a vehicle that crashed. We also have a case from PG County in 2019 where someone during a robbery was shot. They were taken to the hospital. Nobody could identify who they were. Technology was used to help identify him and then let his family know so they could come and see him. Also, the technology is being used by specialized sex crimes investigation units in different law enforcement agencies in Maryland. I will say with respect to accuracy, we talked a bit about that in the discussion. I would say that John Oliver from HBO is not an expert on the technology, and unfortunately we've seen there on that show a misrepresentation that continues on facial recognition accuracy. For example, citing the gender shade study, which had to do with face classification software, which is not the same as facial recognition that's used for identification. These are apples and oranges. Also, misrepresentation of the work of NIST in testing the technologies, where if you look at the most recent results from technologies this summer that were tested, each of the top 150 of the performing technologies are over 99% accurate across black male, white male, black female, white female demographics. So, but here, to remember that in the law enforcement investigative context, the technology is not used for identification. It is only used to help generate leads, which then must be followed up on and verified through other means, much the same as anonymous tips that are submitted through Crime Stoppers or responses to photographs that are released by law enforcement and asked for public input. We believe that this technology is mature, and you can see evidence of this, that Maryland law enforcement's used technology over the last 10 years. It's now being used by CBP to verify travelers coming back into the Port of Baltimore from cruises. The U.S. government's has fielded it for years in airports. Now it's at every single airport in the United States to verify the identity of travelers. And I'll say here that, is there a role for appropriate guardrails to make sure the technology is not abused? Absolutely. And I think as we do that, we must ensure that we're not reducing the current tools that are needed by law enforcement or impeding beneficial uses of the technology for consumers. So in some of those things can be drawn from existing administrative policies. The idea that there's no rules surrounding the technology use, particularly in law enforcement, is just not true. There's many policies that are in place that could be enshrined in legal requirements. You know, one example is disclosing the use of the technology if it's been used in a criminal investigation, as mentioned earlier. Also excluding drawings being put into the system somehow, which is completely inappropriate.
Mr. Parker,
that's
can you
pretty
please
easy to
begin to conclude your testimony?
Yes, that's pretty easy to address. So we'll definitely take a look at the framework as we find out more about it and get a chance to take a look at the proposal. I'd say it's a mixture of some good ideas with some bad ones so far. But in any case, appreciate being part of the process and hope we can continue working with you all.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Next up, we have Joyous Jones.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joyous Jones, and I am coming to testify about the community support program that we had running in Baltimore City. And to give full disclosure that we provide information on 39 homicides, 40 shootings, 94 armed robberies, and 27 carjackings. We increased the case closure rate for the Baltimore City Police Department by more than 50% per independent analysis conducted by the RAD Corporation. The program helped to get a contract killer off the streets of Baltimore, and we know that it was starting to deter criminals. The proof is the detectives were saying that the things that were happening during the day when we were flying was not happening at that rate. They were using nighttime hours to do that when the plane was not flying. So the fact that the plane was flying was a deterrent in itself to keep the criminals off the street. Not only did we deter, but we also employed residents of Baltimore City to track. We trained, we paid, and we paid them $21 an hour with benefits. So they lived in the community, they had a vested interest in the community, and the program was working. Not only that, the plane hours that it flew were in the daytime, as it says, and we had not gotten a fair share or a fair time to actually fly the plane as it was initially contracted. So we were cut, and we laid off all the employees. My thing is, it was working, and if this is data-driven, the data shows that it did work, and it could work. Modifications probably could have been made, but it was working in the city. And if we did that, we would not be, I believe if we were still flying, we would not be at a rate of 271 murders in Baltimore City. And I just needed to say that. And I think that it needs to be revisited with some legislation and with some guidelines. And I think that it will be effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Is there anyone else here in person that would like to testify? Please feel free to step to the podium. Okay. And next I see Rico Dancy. Rico, if you are able to testify, yes, please state,
Okay.
please state your name for the record and your affiliation.
Hi, Yes, my name is Rico Dancy. I am the president of Black Lives Matter for the Deaf. We have questions. The first question I have: a deaf guy was dead. Was put in your booking apartment in October 8th, October 9th. He's found dead. DC is the only police place in the country who have a deaf and hard of hearing unit. Was founded in 2001. We have officers who do American Sign Language. We have iPads, we have video phones. Have Baltimore City ever, or public safety, ever thought about set up a deaf and hard of hearing for people who are deaf and hard of hearing? Not only that, I met with the president of the Baltimore Consortium for the Deaf, and we deaf people have asked this question: when is Baltimore going to put in the legislations that we set up a deaf and hard of hearing unit? If a deaf person call 911 for help, when they see an officer who do not fluent in American Sign Language, don't bring an iPad, don't bring anything, they think that the person who can read lips. Most deaf people cannot read lips. We want to know why is only DC is the only police place in the country who have a deaf and hard of hearing unit. No other police place have a unit like this but the District of Columbia. We want to see if council can they put in the legislation or a policy that we could set up a unit for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Rico. And I appreciate your sentiment. It's something certainly we'll consider. We hadn't considered before this hearing, and I appreciate you at least getting that across to us. I don't see any other hands raised. Oh, I see Charlie Fleischmann.
Let me speak this afternoon. My name is Charlie Fleischmann, and I am in the industry with artificial intelligence. I was mentioned earlier by another speaker, even our capability has improved well over 1,000% in the past 2 years and has continually improved using AI. A lot of the older studies are using have been done on old technology, which frankly didn't work very well, especially with bias. We had deployed our system into over 200 stores, retail stores across the nation. And what we found is that we were able to deter theft in the stores by by just using the facial recognition to identify the individual that was a repeat offender, have the management provide them good customer service. And by the time they've been approached 2 or 3 times, 60% of them stopped stealing from that store. And by the time others that have been approached 6 to 8 times, 80%. That allowed us to concentrate on the 20% that were organized retail crime. This prevented having to call the police and only put processes in by those that were the hardened criminals. I fully agree with you that there needs to be guardrails on, but we shouldn't ban the technology. People are always afraid of new technology, especially as it grows and matures. We have always built our system with privacy in mind. We don't believe the data should be sold. We believe that it only should be shared with an agreement where there's a purposes, whether it's between the individual companies or whether it be the police, but that it is controlled and that data is shared. There should be signs that are posted so somebody knows that there's doing. There should be an opt-out capability that somebody can easily be able to take their information out of the system, and it should be sort of you can't do an opt-in because you just can't ask everybody. The other thing is to realize that using facial recognition maybe for indexing but not identification, where you're not putting a name to it, still gives you a valuable crime deterrent without impacting the individual's privacy rights, because everybody's picture is taken by every video camera everywhere else. So the data already exists there. To take that part of the technology away would be harmful to stopping what we see as a violent crime surge in our country. We believe that there are a lot of ways that this technology can be used to help that. And the last point I would like to make, it is a technology. It does not take away from the processes and procedures that detectives and police and store personnel should do by verifying the picture against the live image of an individual known, and put that emphasis back on the individual, not on the technology. That's very effective. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Fleischmann. Any other testimony online or in person? I see Kristen Halsey.
My name is Kristen Halsey. I'm just speaking as a citizen of Baltimore. I think that there's been an underestimation about the potential for data breaches and data leaks. That's something that happens a lot with this kind of technology. The Office of the Public Defender has to retain this kind of information. And like just in Maryland, from 2017 to 2020, they had, I think like 3 different data breaches, and I'm not sure like how much of the information was lost, but like I know in some states, they have to retain this for exculpatory evidence for like sometimes even the lifetime of the accused. So the hackers and people who want to use this information, they attack Office of Public Defenders, police departments, banks, and it's an incredibly lucrative industry. So I think, we can talk about how accurate these systems are, but when we don't have like guidelines in place for security systems, it kind of doesn't really matter. And that's my concern, is the data breaches and leaks more so than it is misidentification. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other folks intend to testify, please use the raise hand function. I'll give folks just a moment. Okay. That concludes our public testimony section. We are going to vote this out. Just before we do that, I want to acknowledge Councilman Porter's joined the meeting. Any questions from committee members before we put this to a vote? Okay, I'll entertain a motion to move the bill.
So move. Second.
Moved by Glover, seconded by Burnett. Conway, yes. Burnett?
Aye.
Glover?
Yes.
Porter? Aye. All right, that passes, and we'll move on to second reading.
Mr. Chair, I'm still here. This is Councilman Cohen.
Councilman Cohen, we're not accepting virtual votes. Sorry for the confusion there.
Got it.
Just for notice next time, and I'll reiterate this, just for members in order to vote, in order to be considered present, we want folks to be here in person. I think it's important for engagement for the meeting. And that's just a standard we've decided to keep across all committees going forward. So sorry, Councilman Cohen. That said, I want to hand off to our sponsor if you have any closing comments or words.
No. So thank you again, colleagues and public who engaged with us on this issue. We're working, like I said, fairly diligently to build out a regulatory bill that we will double back around to all of the folks who've participated in our stakeholder interview process for additional feedback and review, and hopefully have something in the coming weeks for the committee to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. With that, we will adjourn the hearing. Thank you.